let me take you back just for a minute. What I want to do today is, briefly here, is I want to tell you three quick things. One is I want to tell you what the job is that I signed up for when I started. Then I want to tell you what the job is that I have now. And then I want to tell you what the job is that I'm going to have, or that future journalists, maybe some of you are out there, what job they're going to have. As I go back to the summer of 1978, I want you to just think about something. Think about when the last time is that you read a newspaper, and I don't mean looked at it, I mean read it. You got your hands dirty with the ink that's on the paper and actually read all the way through it, and on here doesn't count. When I started the business, my boss was this crusty old guy. He fought in World War II in the Pacific. Every night he would eat a roast beef sandwich with mustard on it. And he was always drinking coffee that looked like mud. And he sent me out to cover a soccer game in my first year. The game ended in a 0-0 tie. I came back and I wrote the greatest story ever written. It was 2 pages long, and we had to glue the pages together and roll them up. And I took the 2 pages over to him and handed it to him. I was very proud. The game was nothing. I wrote 2 pages. It was so good that he would obviously just put it in the newspaper. And I handed him the 2 pages, and he just looked at it. He held it up like this. And he crumpled the pages up, and he threw it over onto my desk. And he said, "You should be able to write the end of the world in 1.5 pages." Now, that wasn't easy for me to take, but it was one of the best lessons I've ever heard. And I've abided by it for the years since then, which is that in any kind of good writing, less is almost always more. In an academic setting, I realize if your English teacher tells you to write 8 pages on such a topic, you have to write the whole 8 pages, even if the story or the paper only deserves 5. And I have issues with that, but that's a different thing. But in general, when you're writing anywhere, you can usually go back after you've written and take some things out. In those early days, everything was written on paper. We had typewriters that clackety, clackety, clackety. You might have seen one in a museum somewhere. For like my first 2 or 3 years in journalism, I used a typewriter. We'd go on the road and we had to send on a telecopier, which would send a page back to your paper, and it would take 12 minutes per page. Unless you had to go in a slow setting, then it was 18. So you had to take that into account when you were writing on deadline. Eventually we used computers. So then I would go on the road, and they gave me a computer bag that was the size of a dumpster that I would put over my shoulder and carry on the road. And, it was the size of 25 of these. But those are the mechanical differences in what I do. The philosophical difference was, if someone wanted to tell their story, or if someone wanted to read a story in the community I lived in, they got it from the newspaper. If a politician wanted to say what happened, what was not corrupt about his business, he would tell the newspaper. Maybe the local TV station. But mostly, we were the source of news for the public. And there was a trust there, and there was a chance to make mistakes. I wrote a lot of stories that were wrong, and had to correct them, or had to figure out who lied to me. But there was a vitality to it where you had an interrelationship with the community you were working in. And you were the only one who had it. Other than the TV station, the radio station, there were a very small number of us that were doing this job. And the other important thing is, you had one day to finish the story. If I'm writing a story about a player, I would go interview him at noon, I would talk to his parents at 2, I would talk to his coach at 4, I would go back to the office, hack out the story, it would go down to what we called the composing room, and they would put it together, and then it would be in the newspaper the next day. That was the way the rhythm worked. One day at a time. This changed. And the first way it changed was with television news. There was a time, some of the older teachers and people could tell you here, when the only news every day was your local news at 6 and the national news at 6:30. 1 hour a day, that's it. Then along comes CNN, and they do news all day. Story changes from 9 in the morning until noon. They run a different story. All of a sudden, the newspaper model seems a little bit funky. It doesn't work quite as well, because if I write the story and get it done at 7 o'clock and it changes by 12 or 2 in the morning, I can't change it, and what comes out of the paper the next morning is either wrong or old. It took some getting used to. You could still get great stories, but you had to be careful choosing those stories. But it turns out that 24-hour news was only the beginning. I was working for a paper called New York Newsday in the early 1990s. We had a staff meeting, and we came in to talk about stories, and everybody mentioned what things they were going to work on. And at the end of the meeting, my editor, who was a gentleman named John Pessa, and he said, well, that's not really why I called you all here today. I want you to know that things are going to be changing. There's some things going on with fiber optic wiring and bandwidth, and then we all started, but then he said, what's going to happen is nobody's going to get their news in this. And he held up the newspaper and slammed it down on the table and said, they're not going to buy it on the newsstand. It's not going to be delivered to their home. They're going to get their news on computers. That's how we're going to deliver the newspaper to them. And, to be honest with you, there was a silence in that room, and not because we were shocked. We thought he was crazy. It sounded like the nuttiest thing in the world. I mean, after all, people are going to read newspapers. Just like people are going to go to work on a horse, which is what they were doing 100 years ago, and that's not all that long. But again, it's hard to see around the corner at any point in your life, and the people that can do it are very wise. That was the future, and it was here very quickly. No more typewriters, no more pages, computers.